we would not have the connected ecosystem, the ecosystem services of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest if it weren't for a brilliant piece of legislation that was first enacted in 1965 called the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act. That act, which was put in place for 50 years, brought us a tiny fraction of offshore oil and gas revenues from leasing oil and gas in the, at that time, growing business in California and the Gulf of Mexico in waters owned by all American people. And the vision of that Congress in 1964 when it was passed and 65 when it was enacted was, let's take just a little bit of that revenue and offset the impact that we know we're going to have from drilling for oil and gas in our waters to benefit all American people. And that was the Land and Water Conservation Fund that was created. And billions of dollars, I don't know the exact number because I'm out of the job now, but it was $39 billion when we were trying to get it permanently reauthorized for the next 50 years. We didn't succeed in 50 years or permanent reauthorization, but we succeeded in 3. That is running out in September of this year. But billions of dollars, and a significant amount of that has gone right to this community. In fact, just about every single county in the United States of America has benefited from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Here, we take for granted Gasworks Park. We might take our kids there to fly kites or to go watch fireworks on Lake Union. That was brought to us thanks to the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Improvements to Discovery Park brought to us by the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And 90,000 acres of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest brought to us by funding from the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is extraordinary. So perhaps not surprising, we recommended full funding when I was working for President Obama. We didn't get that, but we did get half. It is really important that this be reauthorized permanently, and we hope that members of Congress from both sides of the aisle will advocate for full funding. This is not a partisan issue. This is something that everybody can get behind. We know that public lands drive the quality of life. That is why our economy here is so strong. We know that we have really good tasting water. The ecosystem benefits that we take for granted, we know actually permeate our souls every time we get out into these landscapes. So as Kitty mentioned, this is under attack by the Trump administration. They're trying to take money from the Land and Water Conservation Fund away from the acquisition of critical resources or capital improvements and use it for operations and maintenance, which was never the intent. We would not have the value, the $1 trillion value of the gem of the Emerald Corridor, Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, without it. And we won't be able to preserve these open spaces that we need in the future without recognizing the value of the assets we have and continuing to support them as we have more and more people. What we need to do to maintain this value and to actually achieve the $1 trillion return that's expected over the next 100 years is make sure that we keep our wildlands wild. I'll use a few examples from the Mountains to Sound Greenway. I used one in my comments earlier, that Rattlesnake Ridge, which is immediately south of I-90 running from exit 27 up to exit 32, and Rattlesnake Lake, which is part of the Cedar River watershed, was all slated for development. It would have been developed. It is not developed. It's a beautiful trail. The woods are growing up. There were, clear-cut forests, and as Jim Ellis said to all of us, we can grow trees, but we can't grow land. And I think that that is a really important point. There were tens of thousands of acres in the Huckleberry Land Exchange, which connected ecosystems in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest from private lands to public lands in exchange for consolidating private lands over closer to Mount Rainier. That makes the forestry more economic in that region, which and working forests are also very good for clean water and clean air, as well as connecting ecosystems in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. None of this happens by accident. It happens because of really hard work. And I remember when I was 35 years old and Jim Ellis was 68 years old when I first started working on the Greenway back in 1991, that I said to him, and I didn't know what a god he was at that point because I was just too young and naive to know better. But Jim, I said, this is like a 25-year project. And he said, yeah, probably. He was 68. He's now at 96. Is that what Jim is? And of course, it's only just beginning. I mean, I used to say commonly as Secretary of the Interior, I'm in the forever business. The decisions I make are going to impact people for generations to come. That's what we have in this gem of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. And I think Doug, who worked for the Department of Natural Resources, I was a banker at the time, we watched the transformation of the U.S. Forest Service go from, it is part of the Department of Agriculture, because trees were considered a crop. Now we understand, and the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest certainly understands that growing forests, healthy ecosystems are so much more than a crop. And working forests, as Doug illustrated to us on the Greenway, are a place that can support permanent carbon sequestration through working forests, clean water, habitat, recreation, and all of those things. And that's a very different viewpoint, more complicated viewpoint, but something that actually reflects what we've grown to understand about the value of ecosystems and ecosystem services. Budgets are created by government, our elected officials. And the way we do that is by raising visibility of the value of these things. I talked about Senator Burr and his advocacy for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I didn't talk about Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, who's senior senator from Tennessee, who's been a strong proponent of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. These are just a couple of many, many examples, and both Republicans in this case, who know that investments in budgets for the U.S. Forest Service pay dividends for their local communities. And that's the link that has been made. So I think studies like the Gem of the Emerald Corridor here will give elected officials in Olympia the kind of support they need for the Department of Natural Resources. It will give our elected officials up and down the Emerald Corridor themselves the tools that they need to advocate for the budget for the Forest Service within the U.S. government. That's where it has to come from. And I will say something I couldn't get done that has now been done by Congress is the beginnings of a fix to how we pay for wildland fire. And just taking and creating the ability for devastating fires that go well beyond the budgets to be treated as the emergencies that they are is going to free up money for the operations budget of the U.S. Forest Service.